That afternoon, the suburbs of Colorado were immersed in a rare stillness. The tree-lined streets echoed only with the sound of wind sweeping through dry leaves, and the wooden doors creaked softly whenever the breeze grew stronger. David, the familiar mail carrier of the town, strolled leisurely along the narrow street, his mailbag heavy and weighed down on his shoulder. Everything seemed ordinary until he heard an unusual sound. At first, it was just something faint, like sand falling onto pavement. But then, when David paused, it stopped too, and when he walked again, the sound resumed, steady and rhythmic, as if it were falling in step with him. The sound was dry, a light rasp, like claws scraping against the roadway. David turned around. Only a few yards away, two glowing yellow eyes flickered in the waning afternoon light. A bobcat, compact yet majestic, stood motionless, its body taut like a bowstring. It did not growl, nor did it leap. It just watched him with a piercing gaze that made David's heart suddenly tighten. In that look was something both wild and filled with something unnamed. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself as cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He was accustomed to aggressive dogs, to the everyday surprises of mail delivery, but he had never imagined that one day he would be blocked on his route by a wild beast in broad daylight. He took a half step back, then stopped, because in its eyes, it seemed to be waiting. Why is it following me? And why is it looking at me as if it is waiting for me to discover something? The question pierced his mind, beginning an encounter David never could have anticipated. David forced himself to breathe steadily, telling himself that the bobcat must have just wandered into the neighborhood by chance. He forced a small smile to himself, trying to ignore the glowing yellow eyes that still clung to each of his footsteps. "Just finish this delivery and leave. Everything will be okay," he whispered in his throat, as much to reassure himself as to affirm anything. In front of the porch of a small wooden house at the end of the street, David bent down and lifted a brown package from his bag. He was used to stiff boxes, thick envelopes, but today this package felt different. It was softer, barely heavy, as if holding something fragile. The moment he set it down, a faint sound came from behind, a stronger, more insistent footstep. The bobcat had moved a few paces closer. David swallowed hard. He turned around, and at that moment the small box slipped from his hands and thudded onto the wooden porch. The thin wrapping paper peeled back under the lightest impact, revealing something that stunned him to numbness. In the yellow-tinted light of the late afternoon, an old silver necklace glinted. The pendant, engraved with a simple floral pattern, had aged in color over time, but David recognized it immediately. It was the piece his mother once wore. She had disappeared many years ago in a forest accident that the police never resolved, never recovered a body from. His chest felt squeezed. Memories rushed back. His mother's gentle hand placing that chain around his neck when he was a child. Her words that, "It will always protect you." Why had that item appeared here, inside a random package, in his hands? And why, at that exact moment, was the bobcat there, watching him as if waiting for his reaction? David's hands trembled as they touched the cold silver, like touching an old wound that had never healed. The initial bewilderment turned into overwhelming shock. His heart pounded erratically, both craving answers and dreading the uncanny coincidence of it all. He looked up. The bobcat was still there, its gaze no longer merely watching. It seemed almost urging, as if it too carried a secret that needed to be delivered. And David, teetering between fear and curiosity, realized that today's delivery had become a journey he could no longer escape. The bobcat did not leave. It stood motionless for a moment, then produced a low, brief growl, as if asserting its presence. After that, it turned and began to walk slowly toward the trail leading into the pine forest at the town's edge. Every now and then, it paused and glanced back at David, its eyes shining in the dimming light of the late afternoon. David clenched the silver necklace in his hand, his heart pounding so loudly he felt he could hear it in his chest. A part of him urged him to flee, to call the police, or at the very least, to leave as quickly as possible. But another part, a stronger part, urged him to follow, not just because of the bobcat's strangeness, but because the item in that package had awakened a deep-seated pain. And a question never answered: what truly happened to his mother in that forest? He began to walk, The crunch of gravel echoed under his feet in the silent space. Ahead of him, Bobcat tracks were imprinted distinctly on the damp ground from last night's rain. They stretched out in a steady line, leading him deeper into the forest. His breathing grew rapid, and his ears began to pick up unfamiliar sounds. From a distance came a metallic clink mingled with the whistle of wind through pine branches. Like chains or hard metal dragged across rotting wood, it echoed in pulses, direction hard to pinpoint, but as though beckoning him to continue. David swallowed dryly, feeling his senses sharpen to their limits. The trail narrowed, the surrounding trees closing overhead into a dark arch. The sun was now only a weak orange streak near the horizon. David bent down and noticed something odd in the center of the path, a torn, discolored piece of map lying on the damp ground as if intentionally left there. He picked it up. On the silvery toned paper were rough outlines of part of this forest, with strange symbols marking certain spots. He shuddered. No way. Who would leave this here? David wondered, his hand trembling as he gripped the map piece. Everything had become too surreal. A bobcat, a necklace from the past, and now a map leading into the forest. All of it felt like a game he was being drawn into. A labyrinth where the boundary between memory, truth, and fear was becoming blurred. The bobcat stopped again, turned, and looked at him, its golden eyes glowing under the dark canopy. It let out a soft growl, not fierce, but more like a compelling nudge. David inhaled deeply, placed the map in his pocket, and stepped forward. He knew that once he followed, there would be no turning back. Inside him, extreme fear mingled with a strange compulsion, as if an invisible hand were pulling him deeper. Somewhere, among the rustling leaves and the faint footfalls of the bobcat, he could hear the beat of his own heart. Clearly, this journey would bring him face to face with the truth, no matter how cruel it might be. Darkness slowly swallowed each of David's steps as he moved deeper into the forest. The peaceful wooden houses and warm lights of town were far behind now. All that remained was the wind rustling through leaves and the faint call of nocturnal birds. The bobcat led the way ahead, its movements graceful, as if gliding just above the ground. From time to time, it paused and looked back at him, its golden eyes glowing like two small torches in the night. Finally, the narrowed trail opened up into an unexpected clearing. In front of David stood an old wooden cabin, its roof covered in rotting shingles. The window panes cracked and shattered like the hollow eyes of someone long dead. The air around it felt colder, thicker, as if the cabin had devoured time itself. Abandoned deep in the woods, the bobcat stopped at the door, sat down, its tail flicking against the dirt, and its gaze seemed to signal David to step inside. David swallowed hard, his hand clenched the silver necklace, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed the door, the hinges groaned, the door creaked open, revealing a thick, pitch-black darkness within. The flashlight on his phone lit up, sweeping across thick layers of dust on wooden shelves and the floor. The air was dense with the smell of damp rot, decaying wood, and rusted metal. In the corner of the room sat a metal box the size of a suitcase. David knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were old parcels, yellowed with time, covered in dust, all of them undelivered. His chest tightened as he recognized envelopes addressed to his grandfather, the man who had once lived in this very town. With shaking hands, he opened one letter. The familiar handwriting of his mother appeared, delicate yet faded with age. "Dad, I am okay. Do not worry. There are things I still cannot tell anyone." David bit his lip. These letters had never been sent. They had been intercepted, hidden away in this place. It felt like fragments of the past were rising out of the darkness. Yet something crucial was still missing. Why? Who had kept all of these letters? And why here, deep in the forest? A different sound broke his thoughts. From beneath the cabin floor came a weak groan. David jolted, sweeping his light downward. In one corner, the wooden floorboards were cracked, and beneath them was a small hatch clumsily covered with planks. He quickly pulled them aside, and a strong, choking smell of damp earth mixed with rusted metal rose from below. He shined the flashlight into the crawl space. The sight froze the blood in his veins. Rows of rusted iron cages stacked atop one another, filled with the skeletal remains of animals long dead. Documents, records, and thick notebooks detailed the operation of an illegal wildlife trade network. one that had once secretly operated right here. Names, locations, dates, all buried in this dark cellar. But that was not all. A hoarse, gasping breath came from the far corner. David aimed his light and his heart clenched. A man, a forest ranger, lay motionless, his arm pinned beneath a fallen beam, his face pale from blood loss. His lips moved, barely able to form the words, "Help me." David dropped to his knees, frantically trying to lift the heavy wood. His whole body trembled, not from fear, but from an overwhelming wave of emotion. All the strange signs, the bobcat's gaze, the necklace, the trail of footprints, none of it had been random. That wild creature had led him here, to a place where a life still needed saving. As David strained with all his might to lift the timber, he looked up. The bobcat still stood at the cabin's door, silently watching, its eyes no longer fierce, but calm and deep, like a witness to everything. It had pulled him off the path of normal life, guided him to this moment, a moment that was terrifying, surreal, and filled with gratitude. David panted, sweat mixing with wood dust on his face. He realized this story was not just about his mother or the letters never sent, but about the life of a man lying before him, and it all began with the eyes of a bobcat in broad daylight. The sound of rescue whistles echoed from afar, blending with the rustling night wind. Flashlights and powerful torches gradually pierced the dense darkness of the forest. David crouched beside the forest ranger, clutching the man's trembling hand, waiting for the rescue team to reach them. His heart still pounded, not from fear, but from a strange and unfamiliar emotion. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder around the cabin, David looked up. The bobcat was no longer at the door. It had stepped out into the pale clearing in front of the wooden cabin, its small yet majestic figure illuminated by the flashing lights of the rescue team. It turned its head, golden eyes glowing one last time, locking onto David, but that look held no threat, no wild aggression. Instead, it was calm, mysterious, as if carrying a message that no human words could ever explain. David clenched the silver necklace in his palm. The chain was icy cold, yet somehow it warmed his chest. He wanted to call after the bobcat, to ask for answers to everything that had happened, but his throat closed up. Only the sound of heavy breathing and the pounding of his own heart remained. Then, without a sound, the bobcat turned and walked away. Its figure disappeared into the forest shadows, merging with the darkness as if it had never existed. Only those glowing eyes remained, burned deep into David's memory, like a fire that would never go out. As the rescue team carried the ranger out, a medic asked David a few questions. He nodded, gave short answers, but his mind drifted elsewhere. One question echoed in his heart. How did it know? And why did it choose me? David looked up into the thick night above the Colorado forest. Wind howled through the treetops, carrying the scent of damp earth and something hauntingly familiar. But to him, everything had changed. Somewhere in that darkness, a gaze had just vanished, leaving behind a void that nothing could ever fill. There are connections that stretch beyond human understanding. Between fear and salvation, David realized the boundary between human and wild is not so absolute. Empathy can bloom in the most unexpected places, even in the eyes of a wild animal. Sometimes, our Savior is not one of our own kind, but one of those beings we thought only brought danger. And in that moment, the bobcat's eyes held an invisible message, that all living creatures are bound by a single thread. Fragile, but eternal.